90 million years ago, the Sahara Desert did not exist. A warm inland sea stretched across the heart of Africa, reaching nearly 3,200 kilometers, about 2,000 miles from north to south, as it flowed from the shores of what is now the Mediterranean deep into the continent, dividing Africa in two. And it remained there for 50 million years. Everything the Sahara is today rests on top of what that ocean left behind. Its bones are still there, not buried miles beneath the desert. In many places, the wind has stripped the rock bare, exposing marine shells, enormous fish teeth, and the vertebrae of creatures that should not have existed in a place people now imagine as endless sand. Sea snakes reached 24 meters, about 79 feet in length. The largest snake alive today grows to only around 7 meters, about 23 feet. Along the coastline, a predator even longer than Tyrannosaurus rex entered the water. It is the only dinosaur ever confirmed to have lived as a true swimmer. Its bones became heavier. Its tail became a paddle. It evolved for this sea, and the ecosystem preserved along its shores reveals something even stranger. It is the only environment ever discovered where carnivores outnumbered herbivores. No living ecosystem looks like it. Scientists are still trying to understand how it was even possible. This ocean had a name, the Trans-Saharan Seaway. It survived the asteroid that ended the age of the non-avian dinosaurs. When it finally disappeared, it did not leave a desert behind. It left a rainforest. Then the story changed again. Only later did the sand arrive. 3 scientific expeditions have reached these fossil beds. The last one ended in 2008 after security threats forced the team to abandon the field. No major expedition has returned since. Everything we know about this vanished ocean comes from what those few researchers were able to recover before the desert closed behind them. Tonight, we're returning to the Trans-Saharan Seaway to uncover how an ocean formed in the middle of Africa, why it became one of the strangest marine ecosystems Earth has ever produced, what survived the asteroid within its waters, and how a thriving sea eventually became the world's largest hot desert. Long before water crossed the heart of Africa, the planet itself had begun preparing the path. Continents that now seem permanent rested in different places, carried across the globe by movements so gradual that no living creature could have sensed them, yet so relentless that entire oceans were born and erased because of them. The world of the Cretaceous period stretched from roughly 145 million years ago until 66 million years ago. It was warmer than the present in nearly every region. Permanent polar ice had not yet taken hold, and average global temperatures stood about 6 degrees Celsius, roughly 43 degrees Fahrenheit, to 8 degrees Celsius, about 46 degrees Fahrenheit, higher than today. With so much heat stored across the planet, the oceans occupied far more of Earth's surface than they do now. Those elevated seas were not simply the result of a warmer climate. Their deeper cause lay beneath every continent. Earth's outer shell is divided into immense rocky plates that drift upon the softer mantle below. Whenever 2 of these plates separate, molten material rises between them and cools into fresh seafloor. Newly formed ocean crust remains hotter, lighter, and more buoyant than older crust, lifting the ocean floor upward and displacing seawater across the continents. During this chapter of Earth's history, that process unfolded on an extraordinary scale. The ancient southern supercontinent known as Gondwana was coming apart after existing for hundreds of millions of years. South America gradually moved westward. Africa continued its own long journey north. India accelerated toward Asia. Antarctica and Australia also began following separate paths. Every widening ocean basin created another ribbon of young seafloor, and every ribbon nudged seawater farther onto the continents. At the height of these conditions, sea level stood about 300 meters, roughly 984 feet, above its present position. Nearly 40% of the land visible today rested beneath shallow marine water. Broad coastal plains disappeared beneath advancing tides, while low interior basins became connected to distant oceans. Regions separated by immense distances could suddenly exchange marine life through newly opened corridors. Northern Africa possessed exactly the kind of landscape that encouraged such an invasion. Much of its interior formed an expansive, gently sloping plain with very little topographic resistance. There were no towering mountain chains stretching from east to west to block approaching water. Instead, the land descended gradually enough that even modest changes in sea level transformed enormous areas into shallow coastal environments. Waiting immediately beyond Africa's northern margin lay the Tethys Ocean, one of the defining bodies of water of the ancient world. Warm tropical currents flowed across its broad surface between the northern continents of Laurasia and the southern lands of Gondwana. For countless generations of marine organisms, it served as both habitat and highway, carrying life across vast distances through connected tropical seas. As global sea levels reached their peak, the Tethys no longer remained confined to its older boundaries. Water pressed southward through natural depressions in the African landscape, following the easiest routes offered by geology. What began as advancing shorelines gradually became connected embayments. Those embayments widened into expansive marine passages, each advance supported by the immense volume of the surrounding ocean. Nothing about this transformation happened within a single lifetime. It unfolded across millions of years, almost beyond ordinary imagination, until seawater occupied places where forests and river valleys had once stood. Beneath the surface, new ecosystems assembled from travelers arriving through tropical currents, each carried farther into Africa by the same patient geological forces that had already been reshaping the planet for ages beyond memory. Water does not conquer a continent all at once. It advances through the lowest ground, filling one basin, then another, until separate inlets become a single connected sea. Across northern Africa, that patient movement unfolded over millions of years as the waters of the Tethys crossed an increasingly welcoming landscape, following natural depressions that stretched toward the equator. The advancing seaway entered through regions that would one day become Libya and Algeria. From there, it continued southward across what are now Niger and Chad before reaching the coastline of present-day Nigeria. By the height of its expansion, the marine passage extended almost 2,900 kilometers, about 1,800 miles, from north to south. At its southern end, it connected with the newly opening South Atlantic Ocean, transforming Africa into a continent divided by an uninterrupted corridor of tropical seawater. Although immense in length, this was never an abyssal ocean. Across its broadest reach, the flooded interior covered almost 7,800 square kilometers, about 3,000 square miles, of low-lying terrain. Even at its deepest points, the water measured only about 49 meters, approximately 160 feet below the surface. Sunlight easily penetrated much of the water column, nourishing microscopic algae, drifting plankton, and dense marine food webs from the seafloor upward. The entire basin resembled an enormous tropical shelf sea, warm, luminous, and remarkably productive. Its position close to the equator shaped every layer of this environment. Intense sunlight reached the surface throughout the year, while the absence of significant cold water rising from the depths allowed temperatures to remain consistently favorable for marine life. Nutrients circulated through coastal currents, river inflows, and tidal exchange, creating conditions where countless organisms could thrive together across an immense connected habitat. Yet this inland sea possessed another characteristic that mattered even more than its warmth or size. It was never fixed in place. The shoreline breathed with geological time, advancing across the continent before retreating again. Throughout roughly 50 million years of existence, the Trans-Saharan Seaway experienced 6 major cycles of expansion and withdrawal, each unfolding across spans so long that entire groups of species appeared, evolved, and disappeared within a single cycle. During periods of expansion, seawater flowed freely between the Tethys to the north and the South Atlantic Ocean to the south. Marine animals dispersed across these connected waters with few barriers. Fish, mollusks, sharks, and countless smaller organisms expanded their ranges, while genetic exchange linked distant populations into one broad tropical community. The seaway functioned as a living bridge between oceans, separated by thousands of kilometers. The rhythm changed whenever global sea levels declined. As the water retreated northward, broad connections narrowed until they disappeared altogether. Vast portions of the basin became isolated inland seas, cut away from both neighboring oceans. Populations that had once mixed freely now remained enclosed within shrinking waters, separated from their relatives beyond the horizon. Generation after generation lived without new arrivals, following evolutionary paths shaped entirely by local conditions. Isolation transformed the basin into something resembling a natural laboratory, although no walls enclosed it except geography itself. Within those enclosed waters, inherited traits accumulated over immense intervals. Species adapted to familiar prey, familiar competitors, and familiar currents, while outside influences became increasingly rare. Evolution worked with the material already present, refining bodies to suit an environment that repeatedly sealed itself away before opening once more. Across millions of years, those alternating connections and separations produced communities unlike those found in permanently open oceans. The seaway became a place where abundance met isolation, where repeated geological rhythms created opportunities for unusual forms to emerge. Its waters carried more than salt and sediment. They carried the conditions from which some of the largest marine creatures in Africa's history would eventually arise. Among the winding channels where rivers surrendered themselves to the sea, another kind of hunter had already mastered the meeting place between fresh water and salt. Its body belonged neither fully to the land nor entirely to the water. Every part of its anatomy reflected a life shaped by both, making it unlike any other dinosaur known from Earth's long history. Spinosaurus aegyptiacus remains the longest predatory dinosaur ever discovered. Current estimates place its total length at least 15 meters, about 50 feet, while its body mass has been estimated between roughly 6,000 kilograms, about 13,200 pounds, and 20,000 kilograms, about 44,100 pounds, depending on the reconstruction used. Although longer overall than Tyrannosaurus rex, the comparison reaches only so far because these predators occupied fundamentally different worlds and evolved toward very different solutions. Its silhouette would have stood apart immediately. Rising from the backbone was a row of elongated neural spines, each reaching more than 2 meters, approximately 7 feet, in height. Skin stretched across these towering supports to form an immense sail, unlike anything preserved in any other known dinosaur. Whether this remarkable structure helped regulate body temperature, served as a display, or fulfilled several purposes at once remains an active area of scientific study, yet its presence made the animal unmistakable, even from a considerable distance. The history of its discovery proved almost as unusual as the creature itself. German paleontologist Ernst Stromer first described Spinosaurus from fossils unearthed in Egypt during the early years of the 20th century. Then, during 1944, those priceless specimens were destroyed when an Allied bombing raid struck the museum in Munich where they had been stored. For decades afterward, the animal survived only through Stromer's written descriptions, measurements, and carefully prepared illustrations, leaving paleontologists with an incomplete portrait of an extraordinary predator. The story changed when paleontologist Nizar Ibrahim obtained unusual fossil material from Morocco during 2008. Further research culminated in an influential scientific publication during 2014, presenting compelling evidence that Spinosaurus had not simply hunted beside rivers. It had become deeply adapted to life within them, earning recognition as the first confirmed aquatic dinosaur. Those adaptations appeared throughout its skeleton. Its bones exhibited osteosclerosis, an unusual increase in density that reduced buoyancy and helped the animal remain submerged rather than floating upward. The hind limbs were comparatively short, sacrificing efficient running in favor of movement through water. High on the skull, the nostrils shifted backward, allowing breathing while much of the head remained beneath the surface. The jaws stretched into a long, narrow profile, resembling those of modern crocodilians, armed with smooth, conical teeth designed to seize slippery fish instead of slicing through flesh. Even stronger evidence emerged during 2020 when researchers described a remarkably complete tail from Morocco. Tall vertebral spines supported a broad, flexible fin that generated forward thrust with sweeping side-to-side motion. Experimental testing demonstrated that this tail functioned far more effectively in water than the stiff tails typical of land-dwelling theropod dinosaurs, confirming that swimming formed a central part of the animal's everyday existence. Chemical signatures preserved within the enamel of Spinosaurus teeth strengthen the same conclusion. Stable isotope analysis indicates that aquatic prey formed the foundation of its diet, placing enormous fish at the center of its hunting strategy rather than large terrestrial dinosaurs. The broad river channels, branching deltas, and brackish estuaries flowing into the Trans-Saharan Seaway became its natural domain, where shifting tides blended fresh and marine waters into one continuous hunting ground. There, beneath the rippling surface, abundant prey moved through seasonal migrations, sustaining a predator whose body had followed evolution into a direction no other dinosaur is known to have taken. Beneath the sunlit surface, where broad channels carried fresh water toward the inland sea, another giant followed a rhythm older than any shoreline. It did not patrol the water alone. It traveled with others of its kind, moving in great seasonal gatherings through estuaries and river mouths, tracing ancient routes that linked the open sea with inland spawning grounds. This remarkable animal was Onchopristis, an enormous member of an extinct group called the sclerohinchids. Although it closely resembled a modern sawfish, its closest relatives belonged instead to the lineage that produced skates and rays. Similar bodies had evolved independently through comparable ways of life, creating an appearance that concealed a very different ancestry beneath the skin. Fully grown individuals reached about 8 meters, approximately 27 feet in length. Their broad, flattened bodies rested naturally near the riverbed, gliding over sand and mud with gentle movements of wide pectoral fins. From above, The outline resembled an immense skate enlarged beyond the scale of any living relative. From below, the pale underside blended into the filtered light, helping the animal disappear against the bright surface overhead. Projecting from the front of the head was its most distinctive feature, a rigid extension known as the rostrum. In mature animals, this remarkable structure stretched nearly 2.5 meters, about 8 feet, forward from the skull. Along both edges grew rows of hardened denticles, tooth-like structures whose backward-facing barbs turned the entire rostrum into both a hunting tool and a formidable defense. Once those hooked projections entered flesh, withdrawing them without tearing became extraordinarily difficult. The arrangement of its senses reflected a life spent close to the bottom. Both eyes occupied the upper surface of the head, constantly scanning the water above rather than the sediment below. Meanwhile, the mouth and gill openings faced downward, perfectly positioned for feeding while remaining close to the river floor. Every feature suggested an animal that expected danger from overhead, where larger predators might descend through the water column without warning. Evidence from anatomy and comparison with living species strongly suggests that Onchopristis practiced anadromy, a pattern in which mature animals left saltwater before swimming into freshwater rivers to reproduce. Modern salmon follow the same broad strategy, although they belong to an entirely different branch of the tree of life. Seasonal migrations would have carried immense schools inland, concentrating thousands of individuals within the branching rivers connected to the Trans-Saharan Seaway. Those migrations transformed ordinary river channels into predictable feasting grounds for larger hunters. Fossils from the Kem Kem beds preserve that relationship with remarkable clarity. Paleontologists have recovered Spinosaurus teeth alongside broken fragments of Onchopristis rostra, preserving direct physical evidence that these two giants regularly encountered one another. The marks left upon fossil bone reveal more than coincidence. They record predator and prey sharing the same waters millions of years before either species disappeared. Even so, capturing one was unlikely to have been simple. A careless attack aimed directly at the elongated snout risked driving those reversed barbs deep into soft tissue. Any predator attempting to bite across the rostrum could become momentarily trapped, forced to pull away while suffering cuts from the hooked denticles. Successful hunters likely approached from behind or beside the head, avoiding the dangerous front edge whenever possible. No descendants of Onchopristis remain today. The entire sclerohincid lineage vanished, leaving no modern survivor to inherit its place within aquatic ecosystems. What endures instead are scattered fossils preserved beneath ancient sandstone, offering a glimpse of a specialized hunter whose migrations nourished one of the most extraordinary predator communities the planet has ever assembled. Rock can preserve a single afternoon for almost 100 million years. Along the northwestern margin of the Sahara, a broad escarpment rises from the desert, exposing layers of sandstone that once formed the edge of an immense river delta. These formations, known collectively as the Kem Kem group, remain the richest surviving archive of life along the shores of the Trans-Saharan Seaway, where rivers met tropical saltwater and countless species shared the same fertile boundary. The sediments accumulated during the Cenomanian stage of the Cretaceous period, between roughly 100 million years ago and 95 million years ago. Grain after grain settled through flowing channels, tidal flats, and floodplains before hardening into stone. Every layer preserved fragments of an ecosystem that existed at the meeting place between inland rivers and the expanding sea, recording lives that unfolded beside shifting shorelines across immense stretches of geological time. What emerged from these rocks challenged one of the most fundamental expectations in ecology. Among the preserved vertebrate fossils, roughly 70% belong to large-bodied carnivores. In every well-understood modern ecosystem, herbivores greatly outnumber predators in both population and total biomass because energy diminishes with every step through a food web. Plants support herbivores, herbivores support carnivores, and each successive level contains fewer individuals than the one below it. The Kem Kem record presents the opposite pattern. Rather than indicating an impossible abundance of meat-eating animals on land, the evidence points toward a community whose true foundation existed beneath the water. Rivers, deltas, and shallow coastal environments produced extraordinary quantities of aquatic prey. Vast schools of fish, together with invertebrates and other freshwater organisms, carried enough energy to sustain numerous large predators at the same time without depending primarily upon herds of terrestrial plant eaters. Within this single ecosystem lived an astonishing collection of hunters. Spinosaurus occupied the waterways. Carcharodontosaurus dominated much of the surrounding land. Deltadromeus, reaching about 8 meters, approximately 26 feet, in length, added another swift theropod to the landscape, while an unnamed member of the abelosaurid family shared portions of the same environment. Large crocodiliform reptiles moved through rivers and channels. Enormous flying reptiles circled overhead. Sharks entered coastal waters whenever conditions allowed. Each filled a distinct ecological role while existing within overlapping territory. Supporting this concentration of predators was an exceptionally productive aquatic world. Shrimp drifted through the shallows in immense numbers. Bony fish occupied nearly every available habitat. Lungfish thrived in freshwater channels. Ancient lobe-finned coelacanths, descendants of a lineage already hundreds of millions of years old before the first dinosaurs appeared, continued swimming through these waters as living relics of a far older Earth. Seasonal movements of Onchopristis added another immense source of food, concentrating biomass into predictable migrations that echoed through the entire ecosystem. Even with such abundance, the record remains incomplete. Most fossils weather from sandstone as isolated discoveries rather than complete skeletons. Individual teeth emerge from exposed slopes. Fragmented limb bones appear after erosion removes another thin layer of rock. Vertebrae, ribs, and scattered skull elements surface separately, leaving paleontologists to reconstruct vanished animals from pieces gathered across wide distances. Every specimen contributes another portion of the picture, yet large sections remain absent. The Kem Kem group, therefore, preserves not a finished portrait, but the surviving edge of an ancient community. Enough has endured to reveal an ecosystem unlike any known today, where rivers nourished extraordinary concentrations of life, and predators flourished in numbers that still challenge familiar ecological expectations. Beneath every weathered layer rests another fragment of that remarkable shoreline, waiting within the stone that once formed the boundary between continent and sea. Not every giant of the Trans-Saharan Seaway entered the water. Along the higher ground bordering its rivers and coastal plains walked another predator, one whose strength came not from swimming currents but from commanding the land itself. Its footprints followed the margins where forests, floodplains, and shorelines met, occupying a neighboring realm that overlapped the great inland sea without belonging to it. This animal was Carcharodontosaurus saharicus, a name meaning the shark-toothed lizard of the Sahara. Adults are estimated to have reached between roughly 12 meters, about 40 feet, and 14 meters, approximately 46 feet, in length. Although similar in overall size to Spinosaurus, its body was built according to an entirely different design. Estimates of its mass suggest that many individuals outweighed Tyrannosaurus rex, making it one of the heaviest terrestrial predators ever known. Its skull alone reflected that purpose. Deep jaws carried long, flattened teeth with finely serrated edges that closely resembled the slicing teeth of large sharks, giving the animal its name. These blades were not intended to grip struggling fish. They were shaped to cut through flesh, open massive wounds, and separate muscle from bone with each powerful bite. Thick neck muscles anchored the skull, while robust hind limbs provided explosive acceleration over short distances, allowing sudden attacks against large prey moving across open ground. The contrast with Spinosaurus could scarcely have been greater. One possessed narrow jaws, lined with smooth, conical teeth, suited for capturing aquatic animals. The other carried broad, cutting teeth, specialized for hunting terrestrial prey. One relied upon waterways, while the other flourished on dry land. Rather than competing directly, each occupied its own ecological role. This arrangement illustrates a principle known as niche partitioning, the process by which different predators exploit separate portions of the same environment, reducing direct competition for identical resources. Within the Trans-Saharan Seaway ecosystem, Spinosaurus dominated rivers, deltas, and flooded channels. Carcharodontosaurus controlled floodplains, wooded margins, and the drier landscapes bordering the water. The shared world remained the same, yet each hunter focused upon a different portion of it. Even so, the boundary between those territories never remained perfectly defined. Shorelines formed narrow transitional zones where both predators could appear. A Spinosaurus leaving deeper water to cross exposed ground became less maneuverable than it was while swimming. At the same time, Carcharodontosaurus searched these margins for animals gathering near rivers to drink or feed. Their paths therefore approached one another in places where neither enjoyed complete advantage, producing an ecological overlap without any close equivalent in the living world. Sharing this remarkable community was another theropod, Deltadromeus agilis. Although smaller than the dominant giants, it still reached nearly 8 meters, about 26 feet, in length. Its long, slender limbs suggest an agile pursuit hunter capable of sustained speed across open terrain. Surrounded by enormous heavy-bodied predators, Deltadromeus represented a different strategy altogether, relying on quickness rather than overwhelming mass. Together, these animals formed an extraordinary concentration of carnivorous dinosaurs. Spinosaurus, Carcharodontosaurus, Deltadromeus, and an additional member of the abelosaurid family all occupied the same broad landscape during the Cenomanian stage. Across the entire 165 million years of dinosaur history, no other fossil community has produced a comparable density of large predatory theropods living side by side within a single ecosystem. Such a gathering could exist only because the foundation beneath it was equally exceptional. Every predator depended upon a source of nourishment vast enough to sustain many hunters at once, allowing several apex species to flourish together across the same ancient shoreline without exhausting the living abundance that supported them. Great size does not always arise from constant expansion. Sometimes it grows from isolation. When a population becomes separated from its closest relatives for immense spans of time, each generation carries only the possibilities already present within that enclosed world. Across millions of years, those possibilities can drift toward forms found nowhere else, shaped by conditions that exist within a single place and almost nowhere beyond it. The repeated advance and retreat of the Trans-Saharan Seaway created exactly those circumstances. Every major regression divided broad marine connections into enclosed basins, trapping communities inside bodies of water cut away from the surrounding oceans. Scientists describe such regions as aquatic centers of endemism, places where species evolve largely in isolation because the exchange of genes with distant populations has been greatly reduced or eliminated. A similar process has long been recognized on land. Islands separated from nearby continents often produce animals that differ dramatically from their mainland relatives. This pattern, known as island gigantism, has given rise to remarkable creatures, including the Komodo dragon, the giant tortoises that once inhabited the Galapagos Islands, the enormous elephant birds of Madagascar, and the giant lemurs that also evolved there before disappearing. Isolation, abundant local resources, and reduced outside competition allow natural selection to favor increasing body size across countless generations. The Trans-Saharan Seaway appears to have produced the aquatic counterpart to that same evolutionary pattern. A comprehensive study published during 2019 by researchers associated with the American Museum of Natural History proposed that the seaway's repeated cycles of expansion and contraction created temporary islands of water. Each isolated basin became its own evolutionary arena, where enclosed populations followed independent pathways over immense intervals before any later reconnection could occur. The fossil record reflects those prolonged experiments. Numerous animals recovered from the seaway are described by paleontologists as among the largest members of their respective evolutionary groups ever known. This distinction reaches beyond Africa or the Cretaceous period. It places them among the greatest examples of their entire lineage across Earth's history, suggesting that the conditions operating within these isolated waters repeatedly favored exceptional growth. Perhaps no discovery illustrates this more clearly than the giant marine snakes recovered from Mali. The largest known specimen has been estimated to reach about 24 meters, about 79 feet, in length. For comparison, the longest reliably documented reticulated python living today reaches roughly 7 meters, about 23 feet. The green anaconda, the heaviest living snake, typically attains between about 5 meters, approximately 16 feet, and 6 meters, about 20 feet, in length. The ancient marine serpents of the Trans-Saharan Seaway exceeded those modern giants several times over. These were not river snakes or swamp dwellers. Their anatomy indicates adaptation to marine life along the tropical coastlines of the seaway, where warm saltwater stretched across immense distances and supported food webs capable of nourishing predators of extraordinary scale. The same tendency toward exceptional size extended throughout the ecosystem. Giant catfish approached nearly 1.5 meters, about 5 feet, in length, greatly exceeding the dimensions of their closest modern African relatives. Ancient lobe-finned coelacanths also reached sizes beyond those observed in living species. Fish equipped with broad, crushing teeth specialized in breaking armored shellfish, while giant oysters expanded across the shallow seafloor in dense communities. Taken together, these discoveries suggest that gigantism was not confined to a single spectacular predator. It echoed through multiple branches of the food web, from bottom-dwelling shellfish to powerful fish and immense marine reptiles. The enclosed waters of the Trans-Saharan Seaway became a prolonged evolutionary workshop where isolation and abundance combined, allowing life to grow into dimensions that the modern world rarely approaches. Between the deeper channels ruled by Spinosaurus and the higher ground crossed by terrestrial hunters, an intricate network of distributaries spread through the delta. Countless waterways branched, merged, and divided again before reaching the sea. These shifting passages formed a world of their own, occupied by predators that rarely claimed the highest place in the food web, yet appeared almost everywhere the current flowed. The crocodilians of the Trans-Saharan Seaway bore little resemblance to the familiar Nile crocodiles living in Africa today. Rather than carrying broad, heavily built snouts suited for overpowering large mammals at the water's edge, many possessed long, narrow jaws designed for pursuing fish through moving water. Their appearance closely resembled that of the modern Indian gharial. Although this similarity arose through convergent evolution, the process by which unrelated groups independently develop comparable features while adapting to similar ways of life. Every detail of the skull reflected remarkable specialization. Rows of slender teeth interlocked with one another like the points of finely crafted needles. Instead of crushing bone or gripping struggling terrestrial prey, these jaws excelled at seizing swift fish before they could dart away. The elongated snout also reduced resistance while moving through water, allowing rapid sideways sweeps that intercepted prey with remarkable efficiency. What appeared delicate beside the jaws of larger crocodilians proved exceptionally effective within rivers crowded with aquatic life. Several members of this ancient community reached impressive dimensions themselves. Fossil evidence indicates that some Kem Kem crocodiliform species attained between roughly 6 meters, about 20 feet, and 8 meters, approximately 26 feet, in length. Their overall size overlapped with the largest living crocodilians, yet their proportions reveal animals adapted less for wading beside muddy banks than for sustained movement through active channels and tidal passages where fish remained abundant throughout the year. Their place within the ecosystem filled an important middle ground. Spinosaurus dominated much of the larger waterways. Carcharodontosaurus held authority across the surrounding floodplains. The crocodilians occupied nearly everything in between. Freshwater rivers, brackish estuaries, shallow lagoons, and branching delta channels all formed part of their range. They moved easily between environments linked by changing tides, remaining effective hunters wherever water flowed across the landscape. Unlike predators, whose success depended upon seasonal migrations or access to particular habitats, these reptiles likely maintained a nearly continuous presence across the delta. Fish remained available in every major watercourse, allowing crocodilians to patrol familiar territories regardless of fluctuations elsewhere in the ecosystem. Their persistence created a dependable layer of predation beneath the larger, more conspicuous giants already moving through neighboring environments. The fossil record reinforces this impression with unusual consistency. Crocodiliform teeth appear frequently within the Kem Kem deposits, often accompanied by osteoderms, the hardened bony plates embedded within the skin that formed protective armor across the back and sides of these reptiles. Because osteoderms preserve exceptionally well after burial, they remain among the most common discoveries recovered from the sandstone. Together with abundant teeth, they suggest crocodilians were present in remarkable numbers throughout the ancient delta. Their abundance also reveals something deeper about the structure of this vanished community. Extraordinary predators such as Spinosaurus and Carcharodontosaurus naturally command attention because of their immense size. Yet ecosystems are not sustained by rare appearances alone. They depend upon species that occupy familiar spaces day after day, season after season, carrying the continuous work of survival beneath more spectacular encounters. Within the waterways feeding the Trans-Saharan Seaway, the crocodilians became that enduring presence. They threaded through rivers after floods, crossed tidal channels as saltwater mixed with fresh water, and followed schools of fish wherever the current carried them. In a landscape already crowded with remarkable hunters, they formed the steady foundation of predation, linking open water to dry land through lives spent almost entirely within the living network of the delta. Where land yielded to the tides, the shoreline did not end in open sand. It dissolved into forests whose roots stood partly in water and partly in earth, forming one of the oldest confirmed mangrove ecosystems preserved within Africa's fossil record. These coastal woodlands marked the meeting place between continent and sea, creating a living boundary where fresh water, salt water, and sediment blended into one continuously changing landscape. Mangroves are trees specially adapted to life in tidal environments. Their intricate root systems descend into shallow coastal water, anchoring loose sediment while slowing waves and currents. As suspended particles settle among those roots, the shoreline gradually becomes more stable. At the same time, the submerged network creates sheltered spaces where young marine animals can grow with greater protection than they would find in open water. Even in the modern world, mangrove forests rank among the most biologically productive environments on Earth for every square kilometer, about 0.39 square miles of habitat. During the age of the Trans-Saharan Seaway, those forests became nurseries for countless aquatic species. Juvenile fish gathered among tangled roots beyond the reach of many larger predators. Small crustaceans flourished within the sheltered channels, while mollusks attached themselves to submerged wood and firm sediment. Every incoming tide delivered nutrients, and every outgoing current carried organic material back into the surrounding waters, sustaining life far beyond the forest itself. The shallows nearest the coast supported an equally remarkable invertebrate community. Giant oysters clustered together in dense beds. Clams buried themselves beneath soft sediment. Sea urchins grazed across the sea floor, while tropical mollusks occupied nearly every available surface. Their abundance encouraged the evolution of specialized fish possessing broad, pavement-like teeth capable of crushing thick shells into fragments before swallowing the soft tissue inside. Every adaptation reflected a food source waiting to be exploited. Life along the shore did not belong exclusively to reptiles and fish. Fossils recovered from Mali reveal the presence of some of the earliest known relatives of elephants, primitive members of the evolutionary lineage known as Proboscidea. They bore little resemblance to the towering elephants of today. These early mammals were comparatively small, lightly built, and adapted to a generalized way of life rather than the specialized grazing habits that would emerge much later. Their world unfolded at the edge of the mangrove forest. They browsed among low vegetation, searched for fruits, leaves, and other available food, and remained close to cover where dense roots and coastal woodland offered some measure of protection. The broad waterways nearby belonged to much larger hunters, encouraging these mammals to spend their lives within the narrow spaces where forest and shoreline overlapped. Looking across this ancient coast revealed an ecosystem woven together through countless relationships. Mangrove roots descended beneath gently moving water. Young fish sheltered among submerged branches while oysters filtered nutrients from the tide. Crocodilians slipped through winding channels connecting river and sea. Small mammals crossed the forest floor, rarely venturing far from vegetation. Beyond the outer fringe of the trees, schools of fish passed through open water where immense sea snakes traveled beneath the surface and Spinosaurus patrolled the currents. Nothing within this shoreline existed in isolation. Mangroves trapped sediment that nourished invertebrates. Invertebrates supported fish populations that expanded into rivers and coastal waters. Those fish sustained crocodilians, giant reptiles, and the larger predators already woven into this remarkable seaway. When those great animals eventually died, their remains settled into the sediments below, returning nutrients that helped maintain the fertile coastal forests from which so much of this interconnected community ultimately drew its strength. No shoreline remained fixed for long. The boundaries of the Trans-Saharan Seaway advanced and retreated with a patience measured not in seasons, but in millions of years. Its changing outline shaped every community that lived within it, making instability the defining condition of this remarkable inland sea. Rather than existing as a permanent body of water, it spent its history expanding across the continent and then withdrawing again, over and over, through 6 major cycles that transformed the lives of everything carried within its shores. Each flooding phase, known as a transgression, began as marine waters spread southward from the ancient Tethys Ocean while remaining connected to the newly opening South Atlantic Ocean. For a time, the seaway became part of the wider global ocean. Marine animals entered from both directions, populations mixed freely, and genetic exchange linked distant coastlines that today are separated by thousands of kilometers, about 1,864 miles. Creatures born near one shore could ultimately contribute descendants to populations far beyond the African interior. Evidence for those changing connections survives within fossils scarcely larger than a grain of sand. Ammonites, extinct spiral-shelled cephalopods closely related to the modern nautilus, drifted through these waters while leaving shells that settled into the seabed after death. Ostracods, tiny crustaceans enclosed within paired shells, spread just as effectively through connected marine environments. Because particular species appeared only during certain intervals, their preserved remains allow geologists to determine when the seaway communicated freely with surrounding oceans and when those pathways disappeared beneath shifting geography. Eventually, each expansion gave way to regression, the gradual retreat of marine water toward the north and south. Connections narrowed, then vanished entirely. Populations that had once belonged to an immense ocean suddenly found themselves confined within shrinking inland basins. Migration ceased. New arrivals no longer entered from distant coasts, and those trapped inside could not leave. Evolution continued without outside influence, shaped only by the environmental pressures contained within those isolated waters. Every period of separation created what amounted to another natural experiment. Different groups of animals became enclosed during different intervals, each beginning its own evolutionary journey under changing conditions of food availability, competition, and habitat. Some lineages disappeared before the next marine expansion returned. Others persisted and continued adapting through repeated cycles of isolation. The extraordinary sizes already preserved within the fossil record likely emerged through these repeated episodes rather than through one uninterrupted history, with each enclosure offering another opportunity for distinctive forms to develop. The shape of those isolated waters depended upon geological foundations laid unimaginably earlier. Ancient Precambrian cratons, the deeply rooted blocks of hard continental rock that form the oldest structural cores of Africa, bordered much of the basin. Because these foundations resisted deformation across immense spans of time, they acted as enduring walls around the changing sea. Water levels rose and fell, yet the broad framework containing those waters remained remarkably constant, guiding every expansion and contraction along familiar paths. From above, the seaway would have resembled a living coastline breathing across the continent. Rivers shifted their mouths. Coastal plains alternated between submerged lagoons and exposed lowlands. Mangrove forests advanced, then retreated with the changing tides of geological time. Aquatic communities adjusted continuously, while terrestrial animals found new routes only to lose them again during the next marine advance. Nothing within this landscape could depend upon permanence. The fossils preserved within the Kem Kem deposits and the sediments of Mali therefore represent only a single chapter from a much longer history. They capture one interval during which the basin happened to be filled in a particular way, supporting a particular collection of species whose ancestors had already endured countless earlier changes. Before that moment, and after it, the seaway continued its slow rhythm of flooding, retreat, renewal, and transformation, leaving behind only scattered fragments from an ever-changing world. Long before the last waters of the Trans-Saharan Seaway disappeared beneath an expanding continent, another event unfolded far beyond Earth's atmosphere. A wandering asteroid followed an orbit that had remained unchanged for countless ages, carrying within its path the force to reshape nearly every ecosystem on the planet. By the time it reached Earth, the inland sea that had flourished across northern Africa had already endured tens of millions of years of change, its coastlines advancing and retreating through repeated geological rhythms that had transformed life again and again. Around 66 million years ago, approximately 34 million years into the history of the Seaway, that asteroid struck the region now known as the Yucatan Peninsula. Measuring about 10 kilometers, about 6 miles, across, the impactor collided with astonishing speed. The explosion released energy estimated to be roughly 1 billion times greater than the atomic bomb detonated over Hiroshima. Bedrock vaporized. Molten rock surged outward. Dust and sulfur rose high above the atmosphere, beginning a chain of planetary changes that reached every continent and every ocean. The event marked the beginning of the Cretaceous Paleogene mass extinction, one of the greatest biological turning points preserved in the geological record. Approximately 75% of all known species ultimately disappeared. Every non-avian dinosaur vanished. Entire branches of the tree of life ended forever, while others survived only as scattered remnants that would eventually diversify into new forms across the recovering world. Yet one of the most recognizable inhabitants of the Trans-Saharan Seaway never witnessed that catastrophe. The fossil record of Spinosaurus appears to end between approximately 95 million years and approximately 93 million years ago, well before the asteroid arrived. Evidence suggests that changing environments accompanying later regression phases of the Seaway likely removed the habitats upon which this remarkable predator depended. Its disappearance belonged to a different chapter, separated from the famous extinction by tens of millions of years. The Seaway itself, however, remained part of Earth's geography when the boundary between the Cretaceous and the Paleogene arrived. Sediments preserved within present-day Mali span that remarkable transition, offering scientists one of the uncommon opportunities to examine an aquatic ecosystem before, during, and after the extinction event within a continuous geological sequence. Layer after layer accumulated across the basin, recording changes that unfolded with extraordinary patience beneath the surface of ancient waters. Research led by scientist Maureen O'Leary and her colleagues revealed an unexpected pattern within those rocks. Rather than showing an abrupt collapse across every aquatic lineage, parts of the Seaway appear to have experienced a comparatively moderated response. Several species crossed the Cretaceous-Paleogene boundary with evidence of continued existence, suggesting that the inland marine environment buffered some of the earliest consequences experienced across land. One explanation centers upon the impact winter that followed the collision. Dust and aerosols blocked sunlight, dramatically reducing photosynthesis across terrestrial ecosystems. Forests and flowering plants suffered severe disruption, and food webs built upon fresh plant growth rapidly weakened. Marine environments certainly experienced profound consequences as well, yet existing organic material suspended through the water column, together with nutrient circulation already operating within aquatic systems, may have softened the immediate ecological shock for some inhabitants of the seaway. Today, the boundaries separating those two worlds can still be traced within the sedimentary rocks of Mali. It appears as a distinct geological horizon, a narrow layer where the final chapter of the age of dinosaurs gives way to the beginning of another age. Those sediments now rest beneath Saharan sands instead of warm coastal waters, preserving a transition that unfolded over unimaginable spans of time. The inland sea endured beyond the impact that erased the non-avian dinosaurs, carrying fragments of its living communities into a transformed Earth. Its waters continued to reflect changing skies, while the surrounding world slowly assembled a different future, one shaped by survivors whose stories had only begun. Morning returned to the Trans-Saharan Seaway beneath unfamiliar skies. The waters still reflected sunlight, tides continued to move through channels and coastal forests, and sediments settled across the basin as they always had. Yet the world surrounding those waters had been permanently altered. The great non-avian dinosaurs that had dominated shorelines and river mouths were gone, leaving ecological space that would gradually be claimed by survivors whose ancestors had once lived in their shadow. During the Paleogene, the geological era that followed the Cretaceous-Paleogene extinction, the seaway remained part of northern Africa, even as its boundaries continued their long pattern of contraction. Life reorganized rather than beginning anew. Food webs persisted, but the positions occupied by many of their inhabitants shifted upward. Predators that had once shared the landscape with towering theropods now stood at the highest levels of the ecosystem, inheriting opportunities that had not existed, while larger rivals controlled the margins between land and water. Among those beneficiaries were the crocodilians that had patrolled rivers, estuaries, and tidal channels for millions of years. Their elongated jaws and fish-hunting adaptations remained well suited to the productive waterways feeding the shrinking sea. Marine snakes likewise continued moving through coastal habitats, occupying hunting grounds no longer visited by immense dinosaurian competitors. The disappearance of the largest terrestrial predators did not erase predation itself. Instead, it redistributed influence among lineages already deeply established within the ecosystem. Another transformation approached from the north. Through marine connections leading toward the ancient Tethys Ocean, arrived members of an evolutionary experiment unlike any that had existed before. The earliest archaeocete whales, the first cetaceans, descended from small hoofed land mammals related to ancient deer-like ancestors, had spent millions of years adapting to life within the sea. Their oldest confirmed fossils are known from regions that are now Pakistan and India, bordering the ancient Tethys. By the Eocene, these pioneering whales were dispersing through connected marine environments that included the waters linked with the Trans-Saharan Seaway. These early whales still carried traces of their terrestrial heritage. Some retained functional hind limbs, though increasingly reduced, while their bodies became streamlined for swimming. Their ears evolved to detect underwater sound with growing precision, and their nostrils gradually migrated upward along the skull during the long evolutionary path that would eventually produce the blowholes of living whales. They represented not merely new predators, but the beginning of an entirely different branch of marine life. Evidence preserved within Paleogene rocks of Mali reveals that gigantism had not vanished with the dinosaurs. Fossils from the Eocene include giant catfish, regarded among the largest ever discovered in Africa. Their continued success suggests that the productive waters supporting enormous aquatic animals still supplied abundant energy long after the extinction event. The forces encouraging exceptional body size had weakened little, even as the cast of species steadily changed. Shallower environments remained equally active. Giant oysters and many marine invertebrates continued constructing extensive shell beds that accumulated through countless generations. As shells broke apart and became incorporated into sediment, they contributed to limestone layers, still visible today across parts of Mali, Niger, and Libya. Those pale bands, exposed beneath desert skies, began as thriving coastal communities beneath warm seawater millions of years ago. Mangrove forests also endured beyond the planetary crisis. Fossils preserved within Mali include some of the oldest confirmed post-extinction mangrove remains known from Africa, demonstrating that these salt-tolerant coastal woodlands survived the transition between geological eras. Their intricate root systems continued trapping sediment, sheltering juvenile fish, supporting invertebrates, and stabilizing shorelines while the surrounding ecosystem adjusted to its altered inhabitants. Along those forest margins, early relatives of elephants persisted as well. Compared with their earlier Cretaceous ancestors, these Paleogene members of the lineage had become somewhat larger and more anatomically specialized. Although they still bore little resemblance to the immense elephants familiar today, the gradual direction of their evolution had become clearer. Generation after generation, while the ancient seaway slowly diminished, these adaptable mammals continued shaping a future that would outlast the sea itself. Retreat came so gradually that no shoreline could have marked the moment when the ancient sea began its final farewell. Each generation of animals inherited waters slightly different from those known by the one before. Channels narrowed, coastal lagoons became isolated, and familiar migration routes ended against newly exposed ground. The transformation unfolded across millions of years, guided not by sudden catastrophe, but by immense geological forces whose pace exceeded the lifespan of every creature living within the basin. The final closure of the Trans-Saharan Seaway occurred sometime between approximately 50 million years ago and 33 million years ago. Its disappearance resulted from two vast processes unfolding together from opposite directions. Neither force alone fully explains the ending. Together, they removed the conditions that had sustained the inland sea for tens of millions of years. The first influence reached across the entire planet. During the Cretaceous, exceptionally high global sea levels had flooded continental interiors because vigorous seafloor spreading displaced enormous volumes of ocean water onto the continents. As the Eocene progressed into the Oligocene, that spreading gradually slowed. Oceanic crust cooled, deep marine basins expanded, and the thermal swelling that had elevated sea levels steadily diminished. Water that had once spread across northern Africa increasingly settled back into the deep oceans. The extraordinary circumstances that created the seaway were slowly unwinding. At nearly the same time, the African continent itself was changing. The African tectonic plate continued drifting northward toward Eurasia, beginning the immense continental collision that reshaped the geography of the surrounding world. That convergence gradually narrowed the ancient Tethys Ocean while raising broad regions of northern Africa. Early uplift contributed to the formation of the Atlas Mountains, and the continental interior slowly rose higher above sea level. Land advanced as the oceans withdrew, leaving progressively less space where marine water could remain. Falling seas combined with rising terrain produced an outcome from which there was no recovery. Earlier regression phases had always been followed by renewed flooding, restoring marine connections after long intervals of isolation. This final retreat proved different. Water receded northward toward the diminishing Tethys, yet no succeeding transgression arrived to reclaim the basin. The sixth regression marked the closing movement of a geological rhythm that had repeated across millions of years before ending forever. Even then, disappearance was not immediate. The seaway fragmented into disconnected embayments, shallow inland gulfs, and isolated lakes that lingered across the landscape. Some remnants probably evaporated beneath increasingly warm climates. Others drained through newly established river systems as changing elevations redirected the flow of water. Each fragment became a smaller world enclosed by expanding land, preserving the final echoes of an ecosystem that had once stretched across much of northern Africa. Those remaining bodies of water may have represented the most concentrated evolutionary laboratories the Seaway ever produced. Habitats contracted while populations became compressed into shrinking refuges. Competition intensified as available resources declined, and every generation experienced stronger selective pressures than the one before. Isolation reached its greatest extent because each surviving basin became separated not only from distant oceans, but often from neighboring remnants as well. Evolutionary change within these enclosed waters could proceed without outside genetic exchange until each refuge ultimately vanished. Eventually, the last pools disappeared, marine currents ceased, tidal channels dried. Sediments that had accumulated beneath seawater for approximately 50 million years emerged beneath open skies for the first time since the Seaway had formed. The newly exposed surface was not yet the sweeping desert recognized today. Instead, broad expanses of mudstone, limestone, sandstone, shell deposits, and ancient marine sediments lay uncovered across the landscape, preserving within their layers the accumulated history of vanished coastlines, rivers, mangrove forests, giant fishes, marine reptiles, and predators that had once defined an inland sea unlike any other. Over immense stretches of time, wind, weather, and shifting climates would reshape those exposed sediments again, preparing the foundation for another landscape that still waited far beyond the horizon of this ancient story. The first landscapes, revealed after the retreating sea, bore little resemblance to the desert, now stretching across northern Africa. Beneath open skies, newly exposed marine sediments became the foundation for an entirely different world. Rivers crossed ground that had rested beneath saltwater for millions of years, carrying fresh sediments across broad plains where coastlines had once existed. The ending of the inland sea became the beginning of another long chapter, one written by flowing freshwater rather than tides. The rock record preserves that transition with remarkable clarity. Marine limestone gradually gives way to younger sandstone and conglomerate, deposits formed by rivers instead of waves. Conglomerate, a sedimentary rock composed of rounded pebbles and larger fragments bound together, records energetic streams capable of carrying coarse material across the former seabed. These river systems wandered through a warm subtropical landscape that supported extensive vegetation and diverse animal communities. Rather than an empty expanse, northern Africa remained a region shaped by water moving across the continent. As millions of years passed, the climate continued evolving. The gradual uplift associated with Africa's continuing movement toward Eurasia altered regional geography, while changing ocean circulation and long-term variations in global climate influenced rainfall across the continent. Evidence suggests that increasingly dry conditions became established during the late Miocene, around 7 million years ago, although the transition was neither immediate nor uniform. Different regions experienced changing rainfall at different times, creating a landscape where forests, woodlands, grasslands, rivers, and increasingly dry environments existed together across vast distances. Drying did not proceed in a single, uninterrupted direction. Instead, northern Africa entered a repeating rhythm controlled largely by Milankovitch cycles, periodic variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun, and the tilt of its axis that alter how solar energy is distributed across the planet over intervals of roughly 20,000 to 100,000 years. These astronomical patterns strengthened or weakened seasonal rainfall, causing the Sahara to alternate repeatedly between greener and drier conditions over immense spans of time. The most recent of these greener intervals is known as the African Humid Period. Beginning approximately 11,000 years ago and lasting until roughly 5,000 years ago, it transformed landscapes that are now among the driest on Earth. Grasslands spread across areas presently covered by dunes. Lakes expanded into broad basins, some reaching extraordinary sizes. Rivers flowed through valleys that have since been buried beneath wind-blown sand. Seasonal rainfall supported thriving ecosystems whose existence is now preserved in sediments, fossils, and archaeological discoveries scattered across the desert. Large mammals wandered through these greener landscapes. Hippopotamuses occupied lakes and slow rivers. Giraffes browsed among scattered trees. Elephants crossed open grasslands in search of food and water. Human communities settled beside lake shores and waterways, fishing, hunting, and herding livestock where only arid plains exist today. Their presence remains visible on rock faces throughout Algeria, Libya, Niger, and Chad, where carefully painted scenes portray cattle, wild animals, boats, and people harvesting fish from abundant waters. These images are not legends carried through generations. They are direct records created by witnesses who observed the living landscape around them. Every painted hippopotamus, every herd of cattle, and every fishing scene reflects an environment profoundly different from the modern Sahara. The stone itself became a gallery preserving memories long after rivers vanished and grasslands retreated. Across this remarkable sequence, one landscape yielded to another with extraordinary patience. An inland sea became a network of rivers. Those rivers nourished forests and open plains. Cycles of wetter and drier climates reshaped the continent again and again before the balance gradually favored aridity. Within the span of Earth's history, each transformation remained connected to the one before it, revealing northern Africa not as a place defined by permanence, but as a landscape whose greatest constant has always been change. Across the span of Earth's history, 200 years is scarcely more than a heartbeat. Yet the geological record suggests that one of northern Africa's greatest transformations unfolded within just such a brief interval. Around approximately 5,500 years ago, the African Humid Period reached its end. Landscapes that had supported rivers, lakes, grasslands, wildlife, and growing human communities entered a remarkably rapid transition toward the desert recognized today. The clearest evidence comes from sediment cores recovered beneath the Atlantic Ocean west of Africa. Year after year, winds carried tiny particles of dust from the continent and deposited them on the seafloor, creating an archive that accumulated layer upon layer across thousands of years. By studying these sediments, scientists reconstructed changes in the amount of dust leaving the Sahara through time. Near the close of the African Humid Period, the record reveals an abrupt increase in dust carried offshore, rather than the slow, steady trend expected from a gradual climatic shift alone. Analyses conducted by researchers from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology and Columbia University concluded that, in some regions, the transition from a green landscape to markedly arid conditions may have occurred within as little as 100 to 200 years. The pace varied across northern Africa, with some areas changing more gradually than others. Yet these findings demonstrate that major environmental transformations can occur within only a few human lifetimes. The initial trigger lay far beyond Earth's atmosphere. Throughout the Holocene, subtle variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun and the tilt of its rotational axis gradually altered the distribution of solar energy reaching the northern hemisphere during summer. Those slow astronomical changes weakened the seasonal heating that powered the West African monsoon, the immense circulation system responsible for carrying moisture deep into the continental interior. As the monsoon slowly retreated southward, rainfall over the Sahara began to diminish. By itself, that orbital forcing was too gradual to explain the speed recorded in the sediments. Scientists therefore point to a powerful climatic feedback that amplified the original change. As rainfall declined along the margins of the greener landscape, grasses, shrubs, and trees began to disappear. Bare soil and exposed sand reflected more incoming sunlight than living vegetation. With less solar energy absorbed across the land, the temperature difference between the continent and the nearby ocean weakened. That contrast is one of the principal forces drawing moist air inland during the monsoon season. A weaker monsoon delivered less rainfall. Reduced rainfall caused additional vegetation to disappear. Newly exposed ground reflected even more sunlight, weakening the circulation further. Each step reinforced the next, creating a self-strengthening cycle that accelerated environmental change beyond what orbital variations alone could produce. The landscape crossed a threshold where gradual forcing produced a comparatively swift ecological response. Within only a handful of generations, lakes contracted or vanished, river channels ceased flowing, and grasslands gave way to expanding dunes and rocky plains. Animal populations retreated toward regions where dependable water remained. Human communities also adapted, following rivers, springs, and more reliable rainfall into neighboring landscapes that could still support farming, fishing, and herding. Archaeological evidence records changing settlement patterns across northern Africa during this period, reflecting the profound influence of a transforming climate. Many researchers have proposed that this redistribution of populations contributed to the growing concentration of people within the Nile Valley, where the annual flooding of the river continued to provide dependable water and fertile soil despite the surrounding aridity. Although the emergence of ancient Egyptian civilization resulted from many interacting social, environmental, and technological factors, the drying of the Sahara almost certainly shaped the landscape in which that civilization developed. A sea had become forests. Forests had become grasslands, and the final great transformation turned much of northern Africa into the vast desert that endures today. Long after the final waters withdrew and the last rivers altered their course, the history of the vanished sea remained where it had always been, beneath the ground. The Sahara appears, at first glance, to conceal its past beneath immense fields of sand, yet much of its greatest archive lies exposed instead. Across scattered cliffs, escarpments, and weathered rock surfaces, the ancient seabed continues to emerge as wind slowly removes younger sediments, revealing pages from a story written across tens of millions of years. In the Saharan interior of Mali, erosion has uncovered an extraordinary collection of fossils resting close to the surface. Marine mollusks including clams, giant oysters, and sea urchins, appear alongside shark teeth, fish bones, crocodiliform remains, sea snake vertebrae, and fragments of early mammals. Many of these discoveries owe their visibility not to excavation alone, but to centuries of persistent wind that gradually stripped away loose sand and exposed the underlying rock. Every newly uncovered layer expands the record of an ecosystem that once flourished where dunes now rise. Far to the northwest, the Kem Kem group of southeastern Morocco continues to yield remarkable discoveries from its fossil-bearing escarpments near the modern border with Algeria. Seasonal rainfall carves fresh channels through the sandstone before dry conditions return, exposing bones and teeth that remained hidden until the previous storm. Scientific expeditions carefully document these finds, while commercial fossil collecting has also recovered countless specimens. Although this trade has complicated the scientific record by separating some fossils from their geological context, newly exposed material continues to provide opportunities for important discoveries. Elsewhere across Niger, younger deposits preserve chapters belonging to the later history of the Trans-Saharan Seaway. Fossils recovered from Paleogene rocks include large crocodiliforms, fishes, turtles, and other aquatic animals that lived after the extinction, marking the end of the age of non-avian dinosaurs. These remains demonstrate that the inland waterways continued supporting rich ecosystems long after the disappearance of the giant predators that once dominated their shores. The story did not end with extinction. It evolved into something different while retaining echoes of the ancient world beneath. Libya preserves another important portion of that narrative. There, the geological succession records the gradual passage from marine deposits formed beneath the inland sea into younger terrestrial sediments laid down after the waters retreated. Layer resting upon layer reveals the changing environment with remarkable clarity. Limestone, rich in marine fossils, gives way to rocks shaped by rivers, floodplains, and landscapes exposed beneath open skies. The transition is not merely imagined from scattered evidence. It can be followed directly through the sequence preserved in the stone itself. Some localities display preservation of exceptional quality. Scientists working in these formations have described beautifully preserved shells still lying where the animals originally lived. Clams remain articulated, meaning both halves of the shell are still joined together exactly as they were before burial. Such preservation indicates that these organisms were rapidly covered by sediment before waves or scavengers could scatter them. Comparable examples are uncommon in continental settings of similar age, making these discoveries especially valuable for reconstructing ancient environments. Taken together, these rocks preserve far more than isolated bones. They record microscopic organisms, plants, invertebrates, fishes, reptiles, mammals, and the sediments that surrounded them, each layer adding another piece to a remarkably complete biological archive. The same winds that gradually built the modern Sahara now uncover fragments of that archive grain by grain, exposing evidence that an immense inland sea, its forests, its rivers, and its astonishing creatures were never truly lost. They remained beneath the desert all along, waiting for stone to speak where water no longer could. Long before any fossil reaches a laboratory table, the history of this vanished sea depends upon something far less predictable than geology. It depends upon whether researchers can stand safely where the rocks emerge from the desert. In the Saharan interior of Mali, that simple condition has shaped the scientific story as profoundly as erosion, sedimentation, or time itself. leaving one of Earth's great prehistoric ecosystems preserved in stone, yet only lightly explored by modern science. Professor Maureen O'Leary of St. Tony Brook University led the principal expeditions that transformed knowledge of this forgotten coastline. Field teams reached the fossil sites during 1999, 2003, and again during 2008, supported in part by the Leakey Foundation and the National Science Foundation. Each journey recovered fragments that expanded the picture of an immense inland sea, revealing animals that once shared waters stretching across a broad portion of northern Africa. Yet the discoveries represented only brief glimpses into deposits extending across hundreds of kilometers, roughly 124 miles, of exposed rock, far more than any single expedition could fully examine. The final expedition ended before its work was complete. Security conditions within the Saharan interior had deteriorated as extremist groups increased their presence across remote regions of Mali. Rather than risk the lives of researchers and local collaborators, the decision was made to withdraw. Fossil localities remained behind, still containing their records beneath the desert sky, while the people studying them departed with unfinished notebooks, partially collected specimens, and unanswered scientific questions that continue to echo through paleontology. Since that departure, no major scientific expedition has returned to those same fossil sites. More than 17 years have passed during an era when paleontology has advanced with remarkable speed. Computed tomography scanning can reveal hidden anatomy without damaging delicate fossils. Stable isotope analysis can reconstruct ancient diets, temperatures, and water chemistry from mineralized tissues. Unmanned aerial vehicles can map inaccessible outcrops with extraordinary precision. Molecular clock studies continue refining evolutionary relationships by comparing living descendants with fossil evidence. Many of these techniques either did not exist or remained in their infancy when the Mali material was first collected. The contrast with another great inland sea is striking. During the same Cretaceous world, the Western Interior Seaway divided North America from the Arctic Ocean to the Gulf of Mexico. For well over 150 years, scientists across the United States and Canada have revisited those deposits repeatedly. Thousands of species have been described. Museums preserve immense collections. Food webs have been reconstructed from microscopic plankton to gigantic marine reptiles, creating one of the most thoroughly documented prehistoric ecosystems anywhere on Earth. The Trans-Saharan Seaway occupied a similarly vast stage across Africa and endured through comparable spans of geological time, yet much of its scientific portrait rests upon evidence gathered during only 3 expeditions. The bones, shells, teeth, armored plates, and sediments recovered from those journeys could occupy surprisingly little storage space compared with the magnitude of the vanished environment they represent. From those limited collections emerged estimates of body size, ecological roles, evolutionary relationships, and the first coherent vision of an African inland sea unlike any living ocean. A particularly meaningful milestone arrived during 2019 when researchers synthesized approximately 20 years of accumulated discoveries into a comprehensive reconstruction of this ancient ecosystem. For the first time, many of its extinct inhabitants appeared together within scientifically informed habitat reconstructions, instead of existing only as isolated fossils cataloged in museum drawers. Before that effort, countless creatures from this remarkable seaway had never been illustrated within the world they once inhabited. Their existence remained scattered through stone beneath the Sahara, waiting with remarkable patience for science to return. Far below the dunes that define the modern Sahara, the story refuses to end at the surface. Beneath layers of wind-blown sand, beneath the ancient seabed that once carried waves instead of drifting dust, another inheritance remains. It cannot be seen from the air, and no fossil reveals its presence. Hidden within thick layers of porous sandstone lies an immense reserve of groundwater, a vast archive of ancient rainfall preserved in darkness while continents, climates, and ecosystems transformed overhead. Geologists know this reservoir as the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer System, one of the largest known fossil groundwater reserves on Earth. It extends beneath approximately 2 million square kilometers, about 770,000 square miles, across northeastern Africa, underlying parts of Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and Chad. Although invisible from the surface, its scale rivals that of inland seas, occupying interconnected sandstone formations deposited across immense spans of geological time. The same rocks that once accumulated sediments from rivers, coastlines, and shallow marine environments later became natural containers capable of storing astonishing volumes of fresh water. This hidden supply is described as fossil water, groundwater that entered the subsurface thousands to tens of thousands of years ago during climates very different from those of today, then remained trapped underground, while modern rainfall became too scarce to replace it. Unlike rivers or lakes renewed by seasonal storms, fossil groundwater represents precipitation from another chapter of Earth's history, preserved because surrounding rock slowed its movement until the passage of time itself became the dominant influence. Much of the water within the Nubian aquifer originated during the African humid period, when rainfall spread across a green Sahara between approximately 11,000 years ago and 5,000 years ago. At that time, vegetation covered landscapes that are now barren, lakes occupied broad depressions, and rivers crossed plains where dunes presently stand. Rain soaked into living soils, filtered through layers of sediment, and gradually descended into permeable sandstone. Over countless seasons, those underground spaces filled with fresh water, while the landscape above remained rich with forests, grasslands, wetlands, wildlife, and growing human communities. As climate patterns shifted and the desert expanded, that stored water remained below. The newly formed arid landscape acted almost like a protective seal, greatly reducing opportunities for meaningful recharge. Some of the deepest reserves have been dated to approximately 10,000 years ago through 38,000 years ago, making them older than the desert in its present form. Every drop entering a modern irrigation system from those depths may have begun its underground journey before the familiar Sahara existed, preserved through thousands of years, while civilizations rose and disappeared across northern Africa. Today, the aquifer provides water for agriculture, cities, and communities throughout the countries above it. Wells tap reserves accumulated over immense spans of time, supporting farms and settlements where modern rainfall alone could never sustain comparable activity. Yet scientists emphasize that this resource differs fundamentally from renewable groundwater systems. Under current climatic conditions, replenishment is extremely limited. Extraction continues, but replacement occurs so slowly that many portions of the aquifer function as a finite geological inheritance rather than a continually renewed supply. Depending upon regional pumping rates and local conditions, heavily used sections could experience substantial depletion over periods measured in decades to centuries. The journey that began with an inland sea ultimately reached a remarkable destination beneath the desert floor. Ancient coastlines vanished, forests yielded to aridity, rivers faded, and dunes advanced across the continent. Even so, the rain that nourished the green Sahara never entirely departed. It descended into sandstone, settled within the pores of ancient rock, and remained there through the transformation of an entire landscape, waiting beneath the desert as one of the last living connections to a world that no longer exists above. No shoreline marks the place where the story changes. Instead, the transition unfolds across continents, recorded in stone that now rises far above the reach of any tide. The ocean that once nourished the Trans-Saharan Seaway did not simply withdraw into history. Its waters vanished, yet the evidence of its existence remained embedded within mountains, enclosed beneath plains, and scattered across landscapes separated by thousands of kilometers, approximately 1,500 miles. To follow the fate of the Trans-Saharan Seaway completely is to continue beyond Africa, tracing the destiny of the greater ocean from which it first emerged. The Tethys Ocean had dominated the region for well over 100 million years before its final decline began approximately 50 million years ago. Throughout that immense span, tectonic plates continued their gradual movement across Earth's surface. Africa drifted northward. Arabia advanced in the same direction. India, moving with extraordinary geological speed, approached Eurasia after a journey across the ancient ocean. None of these motions could be sensed within a human lifetime, yet together they transformed the geography of an entire hemisphere. As the continents converged, the broad marine basins separating them narrowed generation after generation of marine life. Water that had once flowed freely between distant coastlines encountered progressively shallower passages until collision replaced separation. Oceanic crust descended beneath continental margins. Sediments accumulated, and the former seafloor experienced pressures capable of folding, fracturing, and lifting enormous masses of rock high above sea level. One result appeared across southern Europe, where the Alps rose through the continuing compression of Africa against Eurasia. Farther east, the Zagros Mountains developed as Arabia pressed into the continental margin. The collision of India with Asia produced the Himalayas, whose towering peaks continue rising today. Although each mountain range possesses its own geological history, all preserve chapters connected to the disappearance of the Tethys. Their foundations contain sediments deposited beneath warm marine waters long before the first mountain summit emerged. The limestone composing much of the European Alps offers one of the clearest reminders of that transformation. Climbers ascending the north face of the Eiger or walking among the pale cliffs of the Dolomites touch rock formed from the accumulated skeletal remains of marine organisms that settled onto the floor of the Tethys. Tiny shells, corals, and other calcium-rich organisms gradually built thick carbonate deposits beneath an ancient sea. Later, continental collision compressed those sediments and thrust them upward until former seabed became towering alpine landscape. Mountains now occupy places where marine life once drifted beneath sunlight, filtering through shallow water. The ocean itself fragmented rather than disappearing all at once. Portions became isolated as rising land severed former connections. The Mediterranean Sea preserves the largest surviving western basin of the Tethys. The Black Sea and the Caspian Sea also represent remnants of that once continuous marine realm, while the Aral Sea, although greatly diminished in modern times, belong to the broader sequence of isolated basins inherited from its retreat. Together, they resemble scattered pages from a single geological volume whose remaining chapters have been folded into the continents. Other legacies remain concealed beneath the surface. Thick layers of evaporite minerals and salt extending beneath parts of southern Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East formed as restricted marine basins repeatedly evaporated during the ocean's long withdrawal. Even the immense petroleum reserves underlying Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Iran, Libya, and Algeria originated from organic material deposited within Tethyan and Trans-Saharan marine environments. Buried through millions of years beneath heat and pressure, ancient plankton and countless other organisms became the hydrocarbons extracted today. The Tethys therefore survives in forms few visitors immediately recognize. Its waters became isolated inland seas, its seafloor became mountain ranges, its dissolved minerals became vast salt deposits, and its living communities became stone and fuel. Across half the world, landscapes separated by deserts, valleys, and towering peaks remain connected by the memory of a single vanished ocean whose southern branch once spread across the heart of Africa. Even with only a modest collection of fossils recovered from the former shores of the Trans-Saharan Seaway, the science surrounding them has continued to evolve. Each specimen has become more informative as new techniques reveal details that earlier generations of researchers could scarcely imagine extracting from ancient bone, tooth, and shell. Rather than relying solely upon outward appearance, paleontologists now explore hidden chemical and structural records preserved within fossil material itself, allowing fragments collected decades ago to answer questions that had not yet been asked when they first emerged from the rock. Among the most influential approaches is stable isotope analysis, the measurement of the relative abundance of naturally occurring forms of elements, such as oxygen, carbon, and nitrogen preserved within fossil tissues. Those subtle chemical differences record traces of the environments in which an animal lived, the water it occupied, the food it consumed, and aspects of its physiology. The enamel of fossil teeth is especially valuable because it often resists alteration long after burial, preserving a remarkably durable chemical archive across immense spans of geological time. That approach has been applied to the teeth of Spinosaurus, recovered from rocks associated with the Trans-Saharan ecosystem. The chemistry preserved within their enamel supports the growing body of evidence that this remarkable predator spent much of its life in aquatic environments rather than remaining exclusively on land. The isotopic signatures also indicate a diet dominated by fish, complementing anatomical evidence already recognized from its elongated jaws, conical teeth, and other skeletal adaptations. Independent lines of evidence, each developed through different scientific methods, gradually converge upon the same ecological portrait. Mechanical experiments have strengthened that picture even further. During 2020, researchers at Harvard University constructed a physical model of the distinctive paddle-shaped tail of Spinosaurus and tested it inside flowing water rather than relying exclusively upon computer calculations. The experimental tail generated approximately 8.4 times more thrust than the comparatively rigid tail of a typical land-dwelling theropod. The result represented a direct laboratory measurement of swimming performance, demonstrating that the unusual anatomy functioned effectively as aquatic propulsion in ways predicted from the fossil skeleton. Beyond individual animals, technology is also expanding knowledge of the landscape itself. Ground-penetrating radar and satellite observations have revealed buried river systems extending beneath the modern Sahara, channels completely concealed beneath sand, yet still detectable through subtle variations recorded from above Earth's surface. These discoveries suggest that the exposed fossil localities represent only a fraction of the geological archive preserved below the desert. Ancient waterways, floodplains, and sedimentary basins almost certainly remain hidden, awaiting conditions that someday permit closer investigation. Researchers continue refining ecological reconstructions through phylogenetic analysis, the systematic comparison of anatomical characteristics to determine evolutionary relationships among organisms. Applied to the mollusk communities preserved within the former seaway, this work demonstrates that many species belong to lineages characteristic of warm, shallow, tropical marine environments. Their evolutionary relationships align closely with the geological evidence, reinforcing the interpretation that the Trans-Saharan Seaway remained a broad equatorial marine system connected to surrounding oceans during much of its existence. Progress has not stopped with reinterpretation of familiar fossils. Material collected during the expeditions to Mali continues yielding formally described species as specialists revisit museum collections using modern analytical methods. Among the most significant additions is the immense Eocene catfish, reconstructed and described through the comprehensive synthesis published during 2019. Fossils stored for years inside drawers became the foundation for recognizing an entirely new chapter of the Seaway's biological history. The remaining challenge is therefore not one of imagination, but of access. Every improvement in analytical chemistry, imaging technology, evolutionary modeling, and remote sensing increases the amount of knowledge obtainable from each fossil already recovered. Yet the buried landscapes extending beneath the Sahara almost certainly preserve far more than has been collected. The evidence waiting within those rocks has endured across millions of years, unchanged beneath the desert, until circumstances once again allow science to continue reading the story preserved there. Nothing in the landscape above suggests that the Sahara has a future beyond its present form, yet the motions shaping its destiny have never paused. They unfold beneath mountains, beneath deserts, and beneath oceans, with a patience measured not in generations, but in geological ages. The same processes that transformed an inland sea into grassland, then into one of the driest regions on Earth, continue at this very moment. Their pace is almost imperceptible, but their destination can be traced through mathematics, astronomy, and the enduring movement of tectonic plates. Among the most predictable of these influences are the Milankovitch cycles, periodic variations in Earth's orbit around the Sun, and the tilt and orientation of its rotational axis that alter how much solar energy reaches different latitudes over intervals ranging from roughly 20,000 years to approximately 100,000 years. Unlike volcanic eruptions or asteroid impacts, these cycles unfold with remarkable regularity. Their timing can be calculated both backward through the geological record and forward into the distant future with extraordinary precision. Those calculations indicate that the climatic conditions favoring a greener Sahara are expected to return naturally sometime between roughly 5,000 years and approximately 25,000 years from now. During that interval, the gradual shift in axial precession is expected to increase summertime solar heating across the northern hemisphere. As continental land warms more strongly, the thermal contrast between land and ocean strengthens once again, encouraging the West African monsoon to penetrate farther into the continental interior and carry renewed rainfall across regions that today receive almost none. The geological record leaves little doubt that this transformation has happened repeatedly throughout the past several million years. Layers of lake sediments, ancient river deposits, fossil pollen, and archaeological sites all preserve evidence for recurring humid intervals separated by drier climates. Every cycle differs in detail because no two moments in Earth's history possess exactly the same atmospheric composition, vegetation, continental arrangement, or ocean circulation. The next green Sahara will therefore not recreate an earlier world exactly. It will emerge under environmental conditions unique to its own age. One uncertain element rests far beneath the surface. The Nubian sandstone aquifer system still stores fossil groundwater deposited when rainfall nourished an earlier green landscape. Some of its deepest reserves, accumulated between approximately 10,000 years, about 33,000 feet, in equivalent geological depth of history rather than physical distance, and roughly 38,000 years before the present, surviving long after the surface climate changed beyond recognition. Continued extraction for agriculture and cities may significantly reduce portions of that reserve before natural humid conditions return. The earliest centuries of renewed rainfall could therefore unfold across landscapes whose underground water supply differs greatly from those of previous humid periods. Far beyond those climatic rhythms, continental motion continues reshaping the framework upon which future climates develop. Africa advances northward by only a few centimeters, roughly 1 inch, each year, yet millions of years transform that modest movement into continental scale change. The Mediterranean Sea continues its gradual contraction as Africa approaches Eurasia. At the same time, the East African Rift System slowly separates portions of Eastern Africa, opening fractures that may eventually widen into an entirely new ocean basin. If another span of approximately 50 million years passes, about 31 million miles in cumulative continental travel cannot describe the process because tectonic motion proceeds continuously rather than as a single journey. Instead, the continent itself will occupy a profoundly different configuration. Mountain belts may stand where coastlines exist today. Inland basins may collect seawater once again. Regions familiar to modern maps could disappear beneath uplifted rock or newly formed marine passages, unlike anything now visible. The Trans-Saharan Seaway belonged to one chapter in this continuing planetary story. The Sahara belongs to another. Neither represents a final state. Earth keeps composing new landscapes from the same enduring forces, carrying every continent through transformations that extend far beyond the span of civilizations, while the slow architecture of the planet continues without haste or conclusion. Perspective changes more than facts ever can. After following the rise of an inland sea, the flourishing of forests, the spread of rivers, the arrival of deserts, and the patient work of fossils beneath drifting sand, the story now widens beyond landscapes alone. It begins to ask not what happened, but how vast the span truly was. The answer is difficult because the human mind measures life in years, generations, and remembered history, while geology keeps its records across intervals so immense that ordinary experience offers almost no comparison. The Trans-Saharan Seaway endured from approximately 100 million years ago until roughly 50 million years ago. Its existence therefore stretched across nearly 50 million years. By comparison, the rise of the earliest cities in Mesopotamia through the entire span of recorded civilization covers only about 6,000 years. Set beside the lifetime of the Seaway, the whole history of civilization occupies only the briefest portion of that interval. The vanished sea remained part of Earth's geography for roughly 8,300 times longer than every kingdom, empire, language, and written record humanity has produced. The contrast becomes even more striking when attention turns toward the modern Sahara itself. The sweeping dunes that define the desert today appear timeless because they shift with every season and extend beyond the horizon. Yet many of those familiar accumulations of sand consist largely of grains, deposited during only the past several tens of thousands of years. In geological terms, that interval passes almost instantly. Beneath those comparatively youthful dunes rests rock approaching 90 million years in age, preserving shells, bones, pollen, and traces of ecosystems that flourished long before the first grain of the present desert settled into place. That layered history transforms the meaning of permanence. The Sahara often seems like the very definition of an unchanging landscape, yet the rocks beneath reveal an astonishing sequence of identities. During only the most recent 100 million years, approximately 2% of Earth's nearly 4,540 million year history, the same broad region has served as tropical seafloor, winding river delta, coastal forest, expansive grassland, freshwater landscape, and finally the immense desert familiar today. Each environment appeared complete while it lasted. Each eventually yielded to another. Every organism encountered throughout this journey occupied only a brief chapter within that immense succession. Spinosaurus patrolled waterways that no longer exist. Giant sawfish drifted through channels now buried beneath stone. Sea snakes crossed warm marine passages that disappeared tens of millions of years before humanity emerged. Early relatives of elephants browsed along mangrove margins that gradually became river valleys and later vanished beneath dry sediment. Entire populations were born, matured, reproduced, and disappeared, leaving behind little more than mineralized skeletons and subtle chemical signatures preserved inside ancient rock. Those remnants carry an important lesson, although not one rooted in melancholy. Instead, they provide calibration for how the planet truly operates. Human perception naturally stretches present conditions backward, encouraging the comforting assumption that familiar landscapes have always looked much as they do now. Our own lives are too brief to witness continental motion, shifting oceans, or climates unfolding across millions of years. Stability therefore feels intuitive because it defines ordinary experience. The fossil record offers a different perspective, grounded entirely in physical evidence. Layer after layer, it documents coastlines replacing forests, deserts replacing wetlands, mountains rising from former seafloors, and living communities adapting to worlds that repeatedly transformed around them. Nothing within those rocks suggests a planet resting in permanent equilibrium. Instead, every preserved shell, every tooth, every leaf impression, and every grain of sediment contributes another page to a biography defined by continual change. Deep time does not diminish the present. It places the present within a story already billions of years in progress, reminding us that Earth has always been a world in motion. A fossil can seem distant until it is remembered that every bone once belonged to an individual living creature. Beneath the measurements, the evolutionary diagrams, and the geological ages were ordinary days repeated countless times across a vanished landscape. Hunger returned with each sunrise. Seasons changed. Young animals grew. Adults searched for food, avoided injury, and left descendants. The immense span of deep time is built from lives that unfolded one moment after another, each as immediate to the animal, experiencing it as the present is to us. Spinosaurus never understood that future generations would regard it as the largest predatory dinosaur presently known from the fossil record. It entered the shallows because fish gathered there. It waited where currents concentrated prey because those places rewarded patience. Muscles, balance, and instinct guided every movement, with no awareness that millions of years of evolution had shaped such remarkable anatomy. Its elongated jaws, dense bones, and powerful swimming tail were not extraordinary from its own perspective. They were simply the body through which it encountered the world each day. The schools of Onchopristis, passing through broad channels, carried no sense of how their lineage would eventually disappear. Remaining together improved the chances of survival, just as countless fish species still gather in groups today. Their distinctive barbed rostrums had been refined over immense evolutionary intervals into efficient tools suited to their environment. To a human observer, that anatomy appears unusual and memorable. To the animal itself, it was as familiar and unremarkable as eyesight or breathing. Farther from the river mouths, the immense marine snake crossed warm tropical waters that stretched beyond every horizon it had ever experienced. A body approaching 24 meters, about 79 feet, in length seems astonishing when imagined from the present, yet no creature carries a sense of being extraordinary. The surrounding sea contained familiar currents, familiar prey, familiar competitors, and familiar places to rest or reproduce. That immense serpent occupied the only reality it had ever known, never recognizing that future ages would regard its scale as exceptional. Along the mangrove margins, early relatives of elephants followed a far humbler existence. They browsed among coastal vegetation, remained attentive to nearby danger, and depended upon habitats that provided food and cover. Nothing in their daily routine hinted that descendants appearing roughly 50 million years later would become the largest land mammals alive. Evolution does not promise future greatness to the individuals living within it. Every generation responds only to the circumstances immediately surrounding its own lifetime. This perspective changes the meaning of the fossil record itself. Fossils are often displayed as symbols representing extinction, adaptation, or geological history, yet each specimen first belonged to an individual organism. A tooth preserves the wear left by repeated meals. A healed fracture records survival after injury. Growth layers within bone reveal changing seasons experienced across childhood and maturity. Even chemical signatures preserved within enamel reflect water actually consumed and food genuinely eaten, rather than abstract scientific concepts. Because of that intimacy, modern analytical techniques deepen rather than diminish the humanity of paleontology. Stable isotope measurements preserved inside Spinosaurus teeth connect directly to meals consumed beside ancient waterways. The precise angle of each barb along an Onchopristis rostrum reflects functional anatomy shaped through countless successful generations. Jaw fragments recovered from Mali reveal the dimensions of giant catfish that once cruised rivers flowing across landscapes, now buried beneath desert sand. These details narrow the distance between observer and organism. The Trans-Saharan Seaway no longer exists, but reality does not vanish simply because its setting has disappeared. Every animal encountered throughout this story occupied a genuine place within an ecosystem governed by the same fundamental necessities that shape life today. Their world was temporary, as every world ultimately is, yet their existence was complete while it lasted. Stone has preserved only fragments, but those fragments still belong to lives that were fully lived beneath an ancient African sky. Knowledge sometimes advances through abundance, yet just as often it advances through remarkable scarcity. The history of the Trans-Saharan Seaway rests upon a surprisingly small collection of discoveries gathered across only 3 scientific expeditions. The final expedition ended before its work was complete, and more than 17 years have passed without researchers returning to those same fossil localities. Everything described throughout this journey stands upon that limited foundation, examined carefully, tested repeatedly, and interpreted with the caution that good science requires. That limitation is not a weakness to conceal. It is an essential part of the story itself. Much of the ancient seaway remains buried beneath rock and sand that have never been systematically excavated. Countless species almost certainly await formal discovery. Many ecological relationships have been reconstructed from isolated bones, scattered teeth, fragments of shell, and incomplete skeletons rather than fully preserved animals. Each conclusion carries evidence behind it, yet each also carries an honest acknowledgement that additional discoveries may refine or even reshape present understanding. The immense marine snake illustrates that balance especially well. Its estimated length of approximately 24 meters, about 79 feet, comes from carefully comparing preserved vertebrae with better-known relatives rather than from a complete skeleton lying intact within the stone. The enormous catfish recovered from Mali is reconstructed primarily through jaw fragments whose proportions closely match living and extinct relatives. Giant coelacanths are represented by scales and isolated bones instead of complete articulated bodies. Every estimate follows established scientific methods, but every estimate also reflects the incomplete nature of the surviving record. Those gaps invite imagination only within the boundaries established by evidence. Beneath unexplored layers may rest predators larger than any yet described from the seaway. Coastal sediments could preserve richer records of mangrove forests, flowering plants, and freshwater vegetation that once bordered its shores. Additional mammal fossils may reveal evolutionary branches presently unknown, extending the history of African lineages through intervals that remain poorly documented. Microscopic organisms sealed within ancient sediment may preserve chemical clues capable of refining reconstructions of water temperature, salinity, and nutrient cycling across different regions of the basin. Complete skeletons may someday emerge for species currently represented only by scattered teeth or isolated elements. Some of the most compelling scientific questions, therefore, remain open rather than answered. Researchers continue examining how marine and terrestrial organisms dispersed between continents, connected by changing coastlines. The processes encouraging unusually large body size within portions of the seaway deserve much finer resolution than present fossils can provide. Paleontologists also seek a clearer understanding of how the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction unfolded across inland marine environments compared with the open ocean, and whether isolated basins experienced ecological recovery along different pathways. None of those questions lack scientific methods. Stable isotope analysis, advanced imaging, microscopic examination, refined evolutionary comparison, and improved geochemical techniques are available today with extraordinary precision. The principal obstacle is not the absence of analytical tools. It is access to the fossils themselves. Rock layers, preserving those answers, remain scattered across remote landscapes where practical and security challenges have prevented sustained fieldwork for many years. There is something fitting about that unfinished state. The fossil beds have not failed science, nor has science exhausted the fossil beds. They simply exist at different stages of the same conversation. The stone continues preserving its archive beneath the desert. Researchers continue refining the questions worth asking. What has been uncovered already reveals an ocean of astonishing complexity. What remains below the surface reminds us that honest knowledge always includes its boundaries. We have traced the shoreline of this vanished world with confidence, yet much of its deeper history still waits beneath the ground, preserved with remarkable patience until discovery becomes possible once again. The desert reveals itself differently to those who learn to read its surface. From a distance, it appears uniform, an immense horizon of pale earth beneath open sky. Closer inspection replaces that impression with countless textures, colors, and layers, each preserving a fragment of a landscape assembled across immense stretches of geological time. The modern Sahara is not an empty expanse concealing its past. It is an archive whose pages remain open beneath the sun, waiting for careful observation rather than dramatic excavation. In parts of Mali's interior, erosion has removed younger sediments and exposed limestone deposited upon the floor of the ancient Trans-Saharan Seaway. A hand placed upon that weathered rock rests on marine sediment laid down approximately 90 million years ago. At the same moment, the desert breeze moves across the present landscape overhead. Two worlds occupy the same place, separated not by distance but by time, their meeting point defined by a single layer of stone that survived every transformation between ocean and desert. The sheer scale of the Sahara makes that archive even more remarkable. Covering approximately 9 million square kilometers, about 3,500,000 square miles, the desert is commonly imagined as an endless sea of dunes. Yet, only about 1/4 of its surface is covered by drifting sand. The greater part consists of exposed bedrock, gravel plains, rocky plateaus, mountain ranges, and salt flats. Each landscape records a different chapter in the continent's changing history, preserving evidence that accumulated through ancient seas, flowing rivers, changing climates, volcanic activity, and persistent erosion. Across Libya and Algeria, pale limestone bands emerge from cliff faces in distinct layers whose internal structures still display the cross-bedded patterns created by currents moving across shallow marine environments. Those structures formed beneath seawater long before the surrounding desert existed. Far to the west, the fossil-bearing sediments of the Kem Kem escarpment preserve the shifting boundary where rivers entered the seaway, carrying sediment from inland forests toward coastal waters. In Tunisia, broad salt flats occupy shallow basins where dissolved minerals accumulated as water repeatedly evaporated, leaving behind brilliant white surfaces that preserve chemical memories of vanished lakes and marine incursions. Wind continues adding new lines to this geological record without altering its deeper meaning. Each powerful storm removes tiny amounts of loose sediment, sometimes stripping only a few millimeters, about 1/8 of an inch, from the surface. That modest change may uncover fossil shells, weathered bones, or fresh sections of ancient rock hidden for centuries. Stratified cliff faces reveal one environment resting directly upon another, allowing geologists to follow the gradual replacement of marine settings by rivers, floodplains, and eventually the landscapes associated with an expanding desert. Long before formal geology emerged as a scientific discipline, the people who traveled these regions recognized that unusual objects appeared where ordinary sand should have contained none. Communities including the Tuareg, the Berber, and the Tubo encountered shells far from any modern coastline, bones embedded within stone, and rocks carrying shapes unlike those produced by ordinary weathering. Such observations became part of lived experience, gathered through generations of movement across the same terrain. Familiarity with the land revealed patterns that written maps could not capture. Seen in this way, the Sahara becomes less a place of absence than one of extraordinary preservation. Every exposed layer, every fossil emerging from weathered stone, and every mineral band crossing a cliff contributes another sentence to a narrative written across millions of years. The desert has not erased the world that came before it. It continues presenting that world in plain view, preserving an ancient shoreline within the enduring language of rock. Every map appears permanent while it is being used. Coastlines seem final, mountain ranges feel immovable, and continents give the impression of having occupied their familiar places since the beginning of time. Yet, the geological record offers a different perspective. The arrangement visible today is only one frame within a planetary process that has unfolded for approximately 4,500,000,000 years. Earth has never settled into a lasting design. Continents drift, oceans expand and disappear, climates shift, and landscapes continually exchange one identity for another. The Trans-Saharan Seaway belongs within that larger rhythm rather than standing apart from it. Its existence reminds us that geography is an expression of ongoing motion rather than permanence. The Sahara became an ocean floor before it became a desert. The limestone composing much of the Alps originated as sediment accumulating beneath the waters of the Tethys Ocean. Petroleum reservoirs beneath Saudi Arabia preserve the transformed remains of marine organisms that once flourished within vanished seas. Fossils emerging from the Kem Kem escarpment record an ancient coastal delta, while rock shelters across the Algerian Sahara preserve paintings created during a greener landscape only several thousand years ago. Even the sweeping dunes that define the modern desert are remarkably recent, with many forming within approximately 10,000 years, about the span of recorded human history. The same principle extends across the rest of the planet. The Himalayan mountain range, now the highest on Earth, did not exist during the age when the Trans-Saharan Seaway supported its extraordinary ecosystems. Around 50 million years ago, the Indian continent completed its collision with Asia, folding marine sediments upward into mountains that continue rising today. Every summit carries within its rocks evidence of an ancient ocean that disappeared through continental movement rather than sudden catastrophe. Peaks now crowned with snow once rested beneath warm seawater inhabited by marine life. The Atlantic Ocean, likewise, appears enduring only because human history occupies such a brief interval. It began opening approximately 180 million years ago as continents separated and new oceanic crust formed between them. Geological models indicate that this ocean will not remain open forever. Across hundreds of millions of years, continued plate movement may eventually bring the surrounding continents together once again, replacing familiar coastlines with entirely different landscapes. Oceans open, mature, and close as naturally as mountain ranges rise and erode. These transformations proceed with extraordinary patience. Tectonic plates advance only a few centimeters, roughly 1 inch each year, a movement measurable today through satellite-based positioning systems and other precise observations. No individual year reveals meaningful change to ordinary perception. Yet the accumulated effect across millions of years reshapes every continent, redirects rivers, creates new volcanic chains, and rearranges the circulation of oceans and atmosphere. The motion is continuous, whether or not it can be sensed within a single lifetime. Viewed through that lens, the Trans-Saharan Seaway becomes representative rather than exceptional. Earth has repeatedly filled continental interiors with inland seas whenever changing sea levels, tectonic motion, and regional topography allowed marine waters to spread across low-lying landscapes. The Western Interior Seaway once divided North America. The Zechstein Sea covered broad regions of northern Europe. The Tethys Sea extended across much of Central Asia. Similar episodes occurred on other continents during different geological periods, each leaving sediment, fossils, and altered landscapes behind. Perhaps the truly unusual feature is not that an inland sea once occupied northern Africa, but that modern observers encounter the Sahara during one particular chapter of its story. The desert feels permanent because it is the landscape inherited by our own brief moment. Geological evidence gently widens that perspective. Continents are not fixed objects but evolving participants in a planet that has never ceased becoming something new, carrying every ocean, mountain, and desert through an endless sequence of transformation. To picture the Trans-Saharan Seaway requires more than remembering a sequence of scientific discoveries. It asks for a way of thinking that does not come naturally to the human mind. The challenge is not the complexity of the evidence, but the scale upon which that evidence unfolds. Human experience is measured in days, seasons, and generations. Geological history unfolds across millions of years, carrying continents, climates, and ecosystems through transformations so gradual that no living observer could ever witness the complete passage. We inherit one chapter and instinctively mistake it for the entire story. That instinct shapes the way familiar landscapes appear to us. We look across the Sahara and imagine permanence, because permanence is what our own lives suggest. We stand beside an ocean and assume its shoreline has always occupied the same place. Mountain ranges seem as though they belong exactly where they stand, as though they emerged fully formed into an unchanging world. Yet every layer of preserved rock offers the same gentle correction. Before this landscape, another existed. Before that one, another still. The sequence continues without interruption, stretching backward through an earth that has never stopped rearranging itself. The Trans-Saharan Seaway invites us to hold two landscapes together without allowing either to erase the other. The desert known today, with its broad horizons, intense sunlight, and immense reaches of open ground, exists as a documented reality. So does the inland sea that occupied much of the same region during the age of dinosaurs. Neither vision depends upon imagination alone. Both are supported by fossils, sedimentary rocks, chemical signatures, and the patient accumulation of evidence gathered over generations of research. The desert is not more authentic because it surrounds us today. The vanished sea does not become less authentic because it belongs to deep time. The same landscape later supported forests, winding rivers, and broad grasslands nourished by changing climates. Rain returned, animals migrated, and entirely different ecosystems flourished where marine reptiles had once moved through coastal waters. Each transformation produced living communities completely adapted to the conditions of their own age. Every plant rooted itself in real soil. Every animal searched for food, avoided danger, reproduced, and disappeared without awareness that another world would someday replace its own. Spinosaurus belonged completely to its rivers and estuaries. The immense sea snake inhabited tropical waters that formed the ordinary background of its existence. Early relatives of elephants browsed along coastal vegetation without any knowledge of the distant future carried within their descendants. Much later, people crossed greener plains and left enduring paintings of hippopotamuses, cattle, and other animals upon stone surfaces that would eventually overlook one of the driest regions on Earth. Today, shifting sand rests above many of those older worlds. Every one of these realities occupies the same landscape at different moments in an uninterrupted planetary history. None of those chapters cancels another. Instead, they accumulate, each becoming part of the foundation upon which the next emerges. The rocks preserve traces of ancient seas beneath younger sediments. Fossils remain within layers later crossed by rivers, grasslands, and eventually desert winds. Time does not erase so much as it builds, leaving earlier worlds folded beneath later ones. To carry all of those landscapes together within a single understanding is less an exercise of memory than an acceptance of how Earth truly operates. Science does not ask us to replace one picture with another. It asks us to recognize that this planet is a succession of genuine worlds, each complete within its own time, each preparing the ground for the next, and each remaining present in the evidence that still rests beneath our feet. Nothing about the surface suggests what rests below it. The Sahara stretches outward in broad expanses of stone, gravel, salt, and shifting dunes, yet beneath those familiar horizons, another landscape continues to exist, preserved beyond ordinary sight. Beneath layers of sand deposited over recent geological time, beneath weathered limestone, beneath ancient river sediments left by greener ages, the remains of the Trans-Saharan Seaway continue to occupy the places where living creatures once moved through warm coastal waters. Time has hidden them without erasing them. The teeth of Spinosaurus remain enclosed within sediment that slowly hardened into rock. Nearby rest the barbed rostral fragments of Onchopristis, preserving details of an anatomy shaped across millions of years of evolution. Vertebrae from an immense marine snake continue to mark the outline of an animal that reached nearly 24 meters, about 79 feet, in length. Vast oyster shells still occupy layers that once formed shallow tropical shores. Fragments of an enormous catfish jaw preserve the proportions of a freshwater giant, unlike any living species. Early relatives of elephants left delicate bones within the same broad region, recording lives that unfolded beside rivers and coastal forests before entirely different worlds emerged above them. None of those remains knows that deserts came later. They entered the ground long before the modern Sahara acquired the appearance that defines it today. They remained in place while shorelines vanished, climates shifted, rivers migrated, forests expanded and retreated, and rainfall gradually yielded to increasing dryness. Layer by layer, the landscape changed above them while the fossils remained enclosed within stone, wading through intervals of time that exceed ordinary imagination. The sand itself is younger than many people realize. Much of it accumulated during the latest chapters of the Sahara's geological history, while the fossil-bearing rocks beneath it often date to around 90 million years ago. The desert, therefore, occupies only the uppermost pages of an archive whose deeper chapters extend far beyond the arrival of dunes. What appears ancient from a human perspective becomes comparatively recent when placed beside the age of the seaway sediments below. Scientific exploration has reached only the outer margins of that archive. A handful of expeditions, scattered exposures across Morocco, Mali, Niger, Libya, and neighboring regions together provide enough evidence to outline an extraordinary ecosystem. From isolated bones, teeth, shells, and scales, researchers have reconstructed food webs, habitats, and evolutionary relationships with remarkable care. Yet the central body of evidence remains buried, extending beneath vast areas that have never been systematically explored. Even without excavation, the landscape continues its own patient work. Wind carries countless grains across exposed rock, gradually wearing away the surface through persistent abrasion. Measured over a single season, the change appears almost non-existent. Measured across centuries, fresh layers emerge. Over longer spans, millimeters of stone disappear, revealing fossils that had remained enclosed since the age of dinosaurs. The same natural forces that transport sand from one horizon to another also uncover pieces of a much older world. These discoveries unfold according to geological rhythms rather than human schedules. A fossil may remain hidden for millions of years before a single season of erosion exposes part of its surface. Another may rest undisturbed long after every living observer has passed away. The desert neither conceals nor reveals its history with intention. It simply continues the processes that have shaped this landscape across immense stretches of time. Far below the familiar horizon, the Trans-Saharan Seaway has not vanished completely. Its living waters are gone, yet the physical record of that vanished world endures within the stone, waiting with extraordinary patience beneath the youngest layer of an earth that is still writing its story. The world's largest desert was once a sea. That sea was warm, shallow, and filled with living creatures that had no reason to become small, because the world around them rewarded abundance instead of scarcity. It endured for roughly 50 million years, surviving the Cretaceous Paleogene extinction before disappearing through the slow work of tectonic change rather than sudden catastrophe. Its waters withdrew, yet the story did not end there. Rivers spread across the exposed land, forests followed. Broad green savannas eventually stretched across regions where waves had once rolled, supporting hippopotamuses, elephants, and people who painted the animals they knew upon stone that still remains. Then, over roughly 200 years, the climate shifted again, and that living landscape gradually yielded to expanding desert. The desert came last. The bones came first. Much of the sand drifting across the Sahara today is younger than the fossils buried beneath it, while those fossils have rested within ancient rock since long before the modern desert existed. Wind continues to reshape the surface, but beneath it, the deeper record waits with extraordinary patience. Earth itself has been changing for approximately 4,500,000,000 years. Continents continue to drift, mountains continue to rise and slowly wear away. Oceans continue to open and close. Climate continues to shift between states that no single lifetime could ever witness from beginning to end. Nothing in that immense history suggests that the present arrangement is permanent. The Trans-Saharan Seaway is therefore more than a remarkable chapter of natural history. It is evidence that the planet has never belonged to a single landscape, a single climate, or a single way of being. Every world that has existed here was complete in its own time, and every one eventually became the foundation for another. Beneath the Sahara, preserved within ancient stone, one of those vanished worlds still waits. Its creatures are gone. Its waters have long since disappeared. Yet the record remains, written in fossils, limestone, and layers of sediment that continue to outlast deserts, rivers, forests, and civilizations alike. Its story is complete. Earth's story is not,